People who have hired a private investigator, what did you find out? My mother's dad walked out on my mom, my aunt, and my grandmother when mom was just 5. A few years later, my grandmother passed away from a grand mal seizure. Mom was taken in by her grandparents, but she always wondered why her dad left and what became of him. In her 40s, she saved up a bit and hired a PI to track him down. Turns out he moved over time from Pittsburgh to California, where he wound up in prison for armed robbery and some other violent crimes. He passed away in San Quentin Penitentiary. I think mom got a lot of closure out of that. She was able to see that life would have most likely been worse had he stayed. At least living with her grandparents, she was loved and raised to fulfill her potential. And I guess with the mention of family secrets, I can't help but wonder if their grandmother knew but took it to their grave to protect their mom. Story 2. My sister, mid-30s, is adopted and hired one to find her estranged biological father. They came back saying that not only was he still alive and nearby, but he had a daughter, meaning she also had a biological sibling. Further digging from the PI uncovered that they weren't just similar ages either, they were exactly the same age. The evidence suggested that my sister had a twin and her birth father had taken the twin and vanished. Huge, life-changing news. Eventually, through more incredible detective work, the PI realized that the daughter was actually just my sister. There was no other sibling and they had just been investigating my sister the whole time accidentally. Needless to say, we asked for the money back. Story 3. When I met my wife, she seemed to have a normal modern family, 2 moms and 2 dads. Over time, however, it became apparent that her stepdad wasn't around much. Holidays, birthdays, you name it. He'd pop in to say hi, grab a nap or whatever, and then take off again. My wife's family thought this was normal. They assumed it was just the way it had always been since they were teenagers. He claimed to have a job following FedEx trucks around the state to prevent theft and substance trafficking. I thought it was strange though and started making jokes about him having another family. Well, I guess it got my sister-in-law thinking because she asked for a favor from a private investigator at her law firm. And sure enough, he had not 2 but 3 wives around the state and 5 other stepchildren between them. My sister-in-law broke the news to her mother, who immediately changed the locks and filed for divorce. They never spoke again. Cold turkey. The divorce was even uncontested. As a final FU, they also sent the PI's report to his other wives. Story 4. My story is a little different. I actually had a private investigator investigate me. About 6 years ago, I became very ill with a variety of issues that left me quite poorly. I was an optician, and since that job required fine motor skills, working with arthritis was never going to be an option. I applied for UK disability support, sailed through the process, and started receiving a monthly payment. Fast forward a few years, I started getting restless at home, so I retrained for a job that doesn't involve my hands. I stopped receiving the main payment, except for the benefit you can get while working, which I used to pay off a better automatic car. Well, a very nasty friend of my mother saw me start work and called the benefits office, assuming I was still claiming the full amount. Unfortunately, she exaggerated and told them I was living a quote-unquote normal life and even running daily. Because of that tip, the benefits office filmed and watched me. They thought they had an aha, gotcha moment. Their investigator provided photos of me walking unaided. When I sat in the meeting with my solicitor and a group of smug fraud officers, I felt sick to my stomach. I really couldn't work out what was going on. They were trying to make it look like I had been running and jogging, but I knew I never walked further than 5 meters to my car. Anyway, my solicitor pointed out that the photos were actually just screenshots taken from a video. He asked to see the actual footage. The video showed me struggling to walk. In one of them, I had a rest on my car before opening the door. In another, I was going into a supermarket and had replaced my cane with a trolley to lean on. You get the picture. The fraud team basically said, oops, and I never heard from them again. I spent a lot of time trying to appear normal, and it bit me in the behind. I certainly never trust those benefit fraud TV shows anymore. Story 5. It wasn't me, but my grandfather hired a PI. He was separated from his brother during the Japanese occupation of China. My grandfather safely made it to Hong Kong and eventually to Canada, while his brother reportedly made it to Singapore or Malaysia, according to family friends at the time. My grandfather spent a good 5 years or so working with a PI to find his brother so they could be reunited. Sadly, with only one picture to go on and the fact that so many people passed away during the war, there wasn't much to lead the way. My grandfather is still alive and always thinks of his brother. It remains his wish to see him one more time. To provide some context, my grandfather worked with this PI many years ago, roughly between 1999 and 2004, with a few touch points in the following years. He eventually became disheartened because he made so many trips to Asia thinking, this is it. But those trips only cost more money and resulted in raised hopes and eventual letdowns. We have no clue if his brother is married, if he actually made it to Singapore or Malaysia, or if he ended up outside of Asia altogether. We aren't even sure if he's still alive, as he would be in his late 80s now. He hasn't spoken about this directly with me, only with my mom. And to be honest, our family hasn't exactly encouraged him to continue the search. My aunts and uncles tell him to move on and enjoy his time in peace rather than in constant yearning. I don't have the status in the family to overstep my mom and her siblings by bringing up the past or asking him to consider a DNA kit. If I did, I'd have to do it in secret and carefully consider the emotional investment he would be making. He isn't living unhappily by any means. He has a great life and was quite accomplished, raising 6 kids who now have families and homes of their own. We all take care of him. He has tons of friends, likes to cook, uses WeChat to talk to everyone, traveled often pre-COVID, and loves to read. He still wants to see his brother, but as time goes by, the memory and the drive becoming more faint in day-to-day life makes it easier for him to accept the circumstances. Story 6. Had a babysitter we thought was stealing from us. Luckily, our neighbor was a PI couple and they ran a background check for $10. Babysitter had a string of DUIs, and a few days before a large fine was due, my camera disappeared. He also stole money from my kids' piggy banks. He sort of disappeared but was also really into Instagram, so I surreptitiously followed him. He started babysitting again for a single mom, easy target, and posted a lot of fun pics with his family. I tracked down the mom and sent her a long email detailing out his whole scam. She said we were right, and it was clear he'd been stealing from her business. He has since gone underground, but I still Google him regularly to see what he's up to. He'd been able to avoid arrest for a while now. Story 7. I used to work for an insurance defense firm years ago. Best PI story I have is where we hired one to tail a guy who was suing our client for an injury that wasn't entirely our client's fault. The guy was refusing to settle and was insisting on going to trial even though we offered a fair sum that would have paid his medical bills. The PI we hired got some good pics that showed the plaintiff was nowhere near as quote-unquote injured as he claimed, but the crown jewel of the photos was one where the guy was walking on a pier with a woman who wasn't his wife, had his hand on her back and everything. Later in a deposition, the attorney slid the picture to the plaintiff and said something like, "Mr. Smith," obviously not his real name, "who is the woman in this picture? We would like to schedule a deposition with her as well." The guy went ghost white and told his attorney he wanted to settle. At least he was smart enough to realize that if his wife found out that the other woman was going to be deposed, he was going to have to get a family law attorney as well because the divorce papers would soon follow. Story 8. My mom's best friend. She divorced her husband and was awarded full custody of their daughter. His family was a crap show. He took his daughter and he and his parents just disappeared. This was easier in 1977 than it is now. She tried hiring a PI but couldn't afford one, so she started learning how to trace people on her own in the days before the internet. She spent years doing this whenever she wasn't waitressing. She did find her daughter in '81, but by this time her daughter was poisoned against her. Mom's friend went on to get her PI license and was a PI specializing in women's issues for the next 2 decades. I don't know what happened to her after that. If she's alive, she would be in her 80s, I think. Story 9. Not a PI and haven't hired one, but I used to work in the office of a PI firm that specializes in insurance fraud. I would edit and sometimes write surveillance and background investigation reports that we passed along to our clients, mostly lawyers and insurance companies. One thing that never failed to surprise me, an astounding number of people who claim to suffer devastating disabilities regularly post pictures and videos of themselves running marathons and building decks in their yards. I'm comfortable saying that in at least half of the cases I handled over 2 years, our clients flagged their claimants as fraudulent because of social media. Disgruntled exes are another significant source of tips. To give an example of one of the more remarkable instances in which social media saved a case, it's summer and on the day of surveillance, our investigator sees the claimant and his family loading their car with beach stuff. The claimant drives for a couple of hours before the investigator eventually loses sight of the vehicle. Side note, tailing someone in a vehicle without 1, arousing suspicion, or 2, losing the vehicle is hard. The investigator, being way too far from his own home to drive home, checks into a motel. The next morning, he checks his phone and finds that the claimant checked in at a water park on Facebook. Investigator makes a pit stop to buy some swim trunks and a beach towel, drives to the water park, and gets hours of covert footage of the claimant swimming in a wave pool, going down water slides, picking up and putting down his kids, and generally doing a whole lot of things you probably shouldn't be able to do with a serious spine injury. Story 10. On the other end of the PI spectrum, I was in a bad car accident about 13 years ago. I was rear-ended at a red light by a lady going 45. Most of my injuries were soft tissue damage minus the TMJ. Fast forward 8 years, finally had my court day to see if I'd get $90,000 in damages. They show camera footage from 4 years prior, covering 3 whopping days of me pushing a grocery cart, carrying groceries, and talking on the phone. Apparently, that's enough to determine that you're fine. Present day, every morning my hands go numb. It takes 3 days to clean 1 room. I can't braid my hair. Various other numerous tasks that take me way longer than any normal 41-year-old. Sometimes you have to do things because you still want to feel normal, not like you're a 90-year-old woman. Story 11. My good friend was only raised by her mom growing up, who would always tell her that her father had walked out on them when she was a baby, and that he had never wanted anything to do with her. My friend took it really hard and struggled through her entire childhood believing in that. But then a couple of years ago, she hired a private investigator to see if they could find him again. Well, they did, and it turned out what her mother told her was a lie. Her dad is seriously one of the sweetest and soft-hearted guys I've ever met. He left because my mom's friend forced him out when he uncovered her infidelity. I guess he wasn't actually her dad because her mom cheated on him while they were together, but he loved her like she was his own and has only avoided contacting her because her mom convinced him he legally has no rights to her child, and even worse, she threatened to accuse him of mistreating my friend if he reached out anyway. Thankfully, my friend is an adult now and has moved out for her mom's house, and she can have the relationship with her dad that she always wanted. It just sucks that she had to go through the effort of hiring a PI to achieve that. Story 12. Not mine specifically, but my mother hired one to spy on the school. See, my little brother is dyslexic and has severe social anxiety and was so struggling a lot in a public school setting. He had an IEP, which the teachers and principal were insisting was being followed. But every day, my brother would come home in tears, shaking because he felt abandoned and stupid. So mom hired the investigator, and sure enough, the teachers were basically just ignoring my brother. They'd sit him in the back of the room and demand he do his work, then wouldn't help him through it. Then they'd yell at him because he didn't do it. Again, he couldn't write because of the dyslexia. With all the evidence, my mom was able to arrange a meeting with the school board and threatened to sue. They agreed to pay his tuition for a private school that was supposed to help. It didn't, and mom ended up just pulling him out and homeschooling him. He's been doing a lot better. Story 13. Not me, but my dad. My mom's a cheater. I could have told him myself, but I don't want to hurt his feelings and he wanted hard evidence anyway. ETA, if I remember right, it was 5 different guys at one time. One might have been the substance dealer, but he might have come later. It's been a while and there was a lot to keep up with. PI was like, I'm sorry, you really got your money's worth. I had his back twice by telling the guys that she was married and that we all still lived together. Pretty entertaining breakups were my immediate reward. Not having to go with her to watch her date guys behind my dad's back was my long-term reward. Turns out, dad doesn't have any bio children. Story 14. Not me, but a friend hired one because he was suspicious his stepdad was being unfaithful to his mom. So he asked me, and I put him in contact with a guy I knew. Bit of a backstory, the stepdad is 5'10", 160-ish pounds. My friend is 6'2", 235 pounds, ripped. At 15, when my friend's mom and stepdad started dating, my friend gave the typical "you heard her, you're doomed" speech. Also, his bio dad walked out on him and his sister when my friend was like 4. It took a while, but my friend warmed up to the guy and he's a good guy. It took my friend and I to a 49ers game once, which was pretty cool. Anyways, the PI said he wasn't cheating. Apparently there was a house on the market that my friend's mom wanted and he bought it. He had been remodeling it for some time and he kept it a secret. As a 5-year anniversary gift to her, he bought it. Anyways, they live in a 5-bed house now. Story 15. I was the recipient of a PI. I came home from work one day and my BF asked to have my engagement ring as he wanted to take it to be professionally cleaned. The second he handed it over, he accused me of cheating on him. The conversation went back and forth for ages. I was beside myself. I couldn't believe what he was saying and he would not believe I was innocent. He then told me he'd had me followed for 6 weeks by a PI who had seen me get into a red Mini. It was a girl I knew giving me a lift to work, but he would not believe me. I knew then it was over and packed my things and left. I told him to get in touch with the PI and have another look at this so-called evidence that I was cheating. An hour later, he turns up at where I was staying, begging to have me back. He'd realized his mistake. There was no way I was going to get back with someone who would behave that way, though, so we parted ways. Story 16. Back in the 90s, my dad had a friend who owned a Renault Clio Williams. One day, someone stole his car in Athens. After reporting the theft to the police, he really wanted to get the car back because it was expensive, so he hired a private investigator to find it. After about a week, he received a call from the investigator telling him that his car had been located at a junkyard outside of Thessaloniki. He traveled to Thessaloniki and confirmed the car was there, then rushed into a police station to inform them of the exact location. Believe it or not, the officer told him not to mess with the owner of the junkyard. Apparently, the place was notorious for car theft and organized crime, and told him to just hope he could get his money back from insurance. Story 17. I used to work for an insurance company that handled injury claims. More often than not, the investigator would find nothing or would give us a lot of videos showing that the claimant was indeed injured. He would then bury the video, of course. There are, on occasion, people who are exaggerating their injuries, but they are by far the minority. The few cases where that does happen has a way of placing unfair suspicion on the legitimately injured people. My favorite example was a time when the insurer sent me hours of video where they had followed this young, healthy-looking, and quite physically fit fella around, leaving his house, going and working outside on a home renovation, doing lots of heavy lifting, carrying things up and down ladders. All this despite a reported back injury. The insurance adjuster was all gung-ho on taking the case to trial without making any offers. Lo and behold, I look at the video, check the age of the claimant in the file, and think to myself, this guy looks awfully young for someone in his 50s. 10 minutes of Facebook research later, I found out that the PI had been following the claimant's 25-year-old son for 2 weeks. The few cases where there is actual fraud make for good stories and get told and retold, but in reality, the vast majority of claimants are on the level despite insurance company Kool-Aiders wanting to believe otherwise. I spent a lot of time having to talk them down while I did that work. Story 18. My dad got my mom pregnant when she was young. Her dad forcibly put the child up for adoption. Nobody ever talked about it, but I found out because my dad became an alcoholic who would black out and talk about what was bothering him. He couldn't take the losses of his oldest son, my mom who cheated on him, and the passing of my little sister. My now ex-wife decided that she wanted to find my older brother, but my paternal grandfather would not cooperate. She asked my mom about it and got as many details as she could. I was against looking for him because he probably didn't know that he was adopted, and I didn't want to screw that up for him. After she got my parents' hopes up, I agreed to hire a PI. The next day, we had pictures of a guy who looks like my uncle, a website to a small company that he had founded, and links to his profile for a lot of high-profile jobs that he's had. We found out that he had been adopted by a college professor at what I would call the Harvard of the Midwest. The guy had a good life, much better than he would have had. I gathered the PI's report, pictures of his biological family, and some medical information that might be of use, and I sent him a package via certified mail. He never responded. Years later, I found out that he was divorced around that same time, so I thought that maybe his ex didn't give him the information. I joined FaceSpace just to find him. He was there with pics, so I knew that it was the same guy. I sent him a PM stating who I am, why I was contacting him, and why he had been put up for adoption. I added the request that he would at least tell me to go to hell or something so that I would have some kind of closure for my parents. His page went private, and I never heard from him. My mom passed away a few years ago. She was glad to know that he was well and successful, but never got to meet him. My dad is doing very well now, but I know that it still eats away at him. And if you're enjoying the video too, don't forget to hit that subscribe and like button for more videos just like this. Story 19. My oldest niece's dad married a woman who was controlling. She ended up convincing him to take my sister to court for full custody of my niece, which ended up stressing my sister out so much that her water broke at 29 weeks. My parents hired a PI and found out that his wife was using EBT to buy groceries instead of the money he was giving her, and that she was getting prescriptions from 12 different doctors and a bunch of other messed up crap. He ended up contacting her parents, who he was told were gone. After he introduced himself, her dad immediately asked how much she took from him. He wasn't the first guy she had done it to. She also wasn't using her real name. He ended up divorcing her, and she's currently doing time in prison for a handful of charges. Story 20. This story is too personal, and I don't want to give too many details to be found out, but my dad hired a PI because an older man was stalking my younger sister at the time, and he was in his 30s. PI found them meeting at different places, and so my dad got a restraining order, not sure if that's what it's called, for the man to not approach my sister anymore. 2 years later, my sister started acting weird and distant from my family. He got another PI to track her, and she was meeting up with this man again. But now she was 18 and said she could do whatever she wanted. She moved out of the house and moved in with this man, and the rest of the story is too sad to tell, but just, wanted to vent out a little through this post I found. Story 21. This is so weird. My mom and I were literally talking about this today. Not me, but my family hired a PI. So my grandpa had a younger brother, I'll call him John, that was always the black sheep of the family. Apparently, my grandpa was quite protective of John and would always defend him to family and friends, saying he was a good kid who would figure his life out eventually. One day, John asked my grandpa to loan him a couple of $1,000s to buy a house, which was no small amount in the 60s, and after talking it over with my grandpa, they eventually did. John skipped town shortly after that and never contacted my grandparents again. My grandpa, being the brooding Irish man he was, never really talked about John after that. In the 80s, one of my mom's cousins was curious what happened to John and hired a PI to go looking for him. They lived in a small town in northern British Columbia, Canada, and after a while, the PI found John living on the streets of Vancouver. My grandmother and my great-aunt flew to Vancouver to see him because my grandpa still wanted nothing to do with it, to see if they could bring him home. My grandmother said when they met with John, he was livid, absolutely freaking livid, that they had found him. He was living with a small group of people that had turned into his little sort of street family. He told them he was very happy with life the way it was, to leave and to never try to contact him again. And that was that. My grandmother and my great-aunt got back on a plane and flew home without him. To our family's knowledge, lived out the rest of his days on the streets of Vancouver. Story 22. I didn't hire him, but my mom did. My father is well over $20,000 in debt from unpaid child support. He was known for living in another state and acting like I didn't exist, although my aunt, his sister, whom I've never met, claimed she wanted something to do with me. He was also in the military but never touched his money reserves, likely because child support services would have seen that and forced him to pay us. After a while, my mom grew tired of his games and hired a private investigator. She told him the whole story and wanted to know where he lived, where he worked, and where his family was. He found out everything. Instead of my deadbeat father being thousands of miles away, he was living just a few blocks away with his sister, the same one who said she wanted to meet me after 15 years and invited me over for lunch. Now, to understand the weight of this, you have to know that my father once tried to total his truck against a brick wall in an attempt to end my mother while she was still pregnant with me. Neither he nor any of his family had ever met me. They all left before I was born. Finding out that same sadistic man was only a few blocks away made me feel unsafe for months. $500 later, all that was left was disappointment and uneasiness. Child support services never received evidence of his residence or employment, and the PI was paid for his work before we ceased the search. Story 23. I was scammed out of over $50,000 for a business I wanted to purchase. The scammer faked tax returns, income statements, you name it, to make it all sound legitimate. He used fake names and a burner phone to hide his identity. I contacted my bank, but they told me, tough crap, even though it was a wire transfer and I had proof of everything. I talked to a few of my police officer friends and they said it was out of their jurisdiction, and there wasn't really anything they could do. I emailed the Attorney General for my state, and he said he couldn't do anything because the crime was likely committed across state lines, so I needed to contact the U.S. Attorney General. I called the USAG assistant, and she told me I needed to talk to the FBI, but warned I would more than likely not get my money back. I called the FBI, and they told me to file a report on ic3.gov, but was warned I also probably wouldn't hear anything back. Finally, I posted in a business group on Facebook and found an additional 7 people who were scammed by the same person. One of them even had audio recordings of their phone calls. Between the 8 of us, the total stolen was over $300,000. I hired an attorney to back me up legally, and he told me I needed to hire a private investigator to find this person. The PI started doing their thing, and within 48 hours, they found out exactly who he was. They provided me with phone numbers, addresses, business names, everything. I gave all the information to my attorney and shared it with the other 7 victims. I looked up the guy's name online and discovered he had gone to prison 20 years ago for the exact same scam. He and 11 other individuals were part of a mafia ring that had scammed $6 million in 2 years, and the ringleader had committed 6 counts of arson. My attorney got in contact with the scammer's attorney, and as of last week, I am receiving all my money back, and so are the other 7 individuals. I am truly disappointed that not one of U.S. government agencies seemed to give a crap about any of this. Story 24. My husband and mother-in-law hired a PI to find out who her biological parents were. She always knew she was adopted when she was 6 months old and that her biological mother was a single woman that couldn't take care of her, but that's all they ever told her. The PI found her mother and found out that she was the product of an affair. Her biological father was a wealthy businessman in the small town she grew up in, and her mother was his secretary. He was married, and it couldn't get out that his secretary was pregnant because she was unmarried and people in town would talk. So he sent her to a home for unwed mothers to have the baby and put her up for adoption. This was in 1942 in a small town in Arkansas, and unmarried women getting pregnant would have been big news. So she called up her biological mother and told her who she was, and her mother was hesitant to meet her, but eventually agreed to it. Turned out she has 2 brothers and a sister and several nieces and nephews, and they kept in touch for a few months. Then they cut ties when they found out what giant pieces of crap my mother-in-law and brother-in-law are, so yeah, my husband doesn't get to know his aunts, uncles, and cousins because of his narcissistic mom and brother. Money well spent, I guess. Story 25. Years ago, my sister was taken from our home in the Northeast U.S. She left a note saying she was leaving for a better life, but we didn't buy it. Because of the note, she was classified as a runaway, which meant an Amber Alert couldn't be activated since it wasn't technically considered a kidnapping. We hired a private investigator that my uncle knew. Within 24 hours of her disappearance, the PI uncovered a string of deleted emails. They contained a description of the car she'd be picked up in and messages from a guy we suspected was her kidnapper. Let's call him Stan. To help paint a picture, Stan was 27 at the time of this incident. You would think that should have been the end of it, but it wasn't. Stan was at his home in Florida. When the police went to his house, he was just sitting there, low-key. It turns out Stan had hired someone to drive from Florida to our home, pick up my sister, and bring her back to him, all under the promise that they'd live an amazing life together. Stan told this driver that my family mistreated her and that it wasn't safe for her there, which were all lies meant to squash any doubt the hired driver might have had. The driver was eventually spotted and tailed by two undercover vehicles. They waited until he pulled over for gas to approach the vehicle, as they didn't know if he was armed or willing to put up a fight. I got my sister back. After years of therapy, she is a functioning member of society with a totally cool significant other. I testified against Stan in federal court. He was locked up 10 years ago and still resides in a federal prison in Florida. It turns out he had coaxed my sister into trusting him for close to 2 years through an online game. What a disgusting trash can of a human. Story 26. My grandmother and great-grandmother had baby boys weeks apart, and my grandmother loved her brother like her son. When he grew up, he got married and had a daughter, but the mom became a substance user and left him with their infant daughter that we'll call Bree. So, on St. Patrick's Day in SF, he goes to a bar, and an intoxicated cop is partying, and he shoots into the air. The bullet instantly ends my grandma's brother. Grandma sues SF Police Department, wins a boatload of money that is put in Bree's name. A few weeks later, Bree is taken. Grandma hired a PI to find Bree. She looked for years and years. They never found anything useful, just that all the money was gone from the account. Fast forward over 30 years, one day Grandma was taught how to use Facebook. You can bet the first thing she did, and she found Bree. No one could believe it. She came to live near us for a while, but she could tell she felt like she didn't fit in. She didn't remember any of us. She ended up moving away and doesn't keep much in contact. She was nice, but too conservative to fit in with our more liberal family. Story 27. I briefly worked for a PI when I was much younger, like 19. Getting the job was a funny story itself. I was walking past the office, which is in a tiny strip mall smack in the middle of a residential neighborhood. On a whim, I decided to go in and see what a real PI's office looked like. Pretty unremarkable, except for the huge biker sitting at the only desk in a polo shirt and slacks. We got to chatting, and I asked if he was hiring. He laughed and asked me what kind of work I was expecting. I told him probably a lot of boring work sifting through papers in the library and courthouse. He laughed again. He did that a lot. We called him Santa because of that and his white beard, and he gave me the job. I worked there for 3 months, during which we did a lot of insurance work that consisted mostly of sitting in a car or reading a book, occasionally taking pictures of some guy in a neck brace or leg cast walking to or from his car, and 2 or 3 times taking pictures of a guy playing baseball or basketball in his backyard. But Santa also had a much reduced rate for tracking down biological parents, siblings, and children. We had one case where this woman in her 30s wanted to find her bio mom. We went on our usual course, visiting courthouses, city halls, and libraries to track this woman down. We spent a whole month on it. We also worked on other cases during that time, which was a bit longer than usual as the woman didn't know her mother's name, only her adopted parents, who had passed years ago. The woman didn't have any of the adoption paperwork either and didn't know where it would be filled. This was in the 90s when not everything was digital. I finally found the adoption paperwork in a courthouse in the next county over and got a name. I was running late. Santa didn't let me work overtime, so I made to drop off the copies of the paperwork at his office and go. But the guy stopped me before I could leave. He was all excited by the mother's name. It's his wife. His wife, who'd given up a baby for adoption 30-something years ago. He called up his wife, who dug up her copies of the additional paperwork from back when, and sure enough, it's a match. We called the client, who didn't answer, then went and picked up his wife and drove to the client's home. She's on the phone with her adopted sister talking about our effort. The PI and his wife immediately bear hugged the woman, who was very confused. Both were too emotional to get the words out, so I explained that the woman was her bio mom and that the PI was her husband. Freaking beautiful scene, man. That memory is one of the things that's kept me from turning bitter over the years. It was enough to put off my then imminent loss of faith in God for another decade or so, that this woman had hired her bio mom's husband to find her bio mom. Story 28. My mom and I got into a big fight one day. She was verbally, emotionally, and physically cruel and manipulative. On this particular day, she told me to get the heck out of her home. I was so overwhelmed but didn't even hesitate. I left my house in my old car while it was storming super hard. She then came outside in the rain with a long shirt on and slammed her hands on the hood of my car, begging me not to leave. She's bipolar and has manic depressive disorder. Anyways, I backed out the driveway and went to my crappy boyfriend at the time's house. She didn't know where he lived but figured I was with him. She called my phone literally hundreds of times, begging me to come home and threatening to end it all through her prescriptions. This was all just an attempt to manipulate me, and she didn't even attempt anything. I stayed the night at my ex's house and went to school the next day. My mom called a private investigator to find me. Apparently, this guy sucked at his job. Somehow he didn't manage to think of attempting to call my school because my mom didn't think I would be at school. He also didn't see me walking to and from school to where my ex lived. It was literally across the street from my school. I don't know, never saw anyone or know much more than that. I went back home after 2 days since the woman my ex lived with told me to leave since she had 3 kids, 2 friends of the kids, 5 dogs, and probably 10 cats living there. She was a hoarder and the house was infested with roaches absolutely everywhere, including inside the fridge and everywhere food was kept. It was so disgusting. So leaving was both good and bad, I guess. Anyway, don't try to get the cheapest PI available. Story 29. My grandma's older brother was taken whenever he was under 10 years old. I can't remember exactly how old, from the state fair. It was believed his uncle was the one that took him because his dad passed away early on and his brother wasn't happy that my great-grandma got custody and another man was raising his nephew. One day, we were sitting out on the back porch looking through old photo albums when we came across a picture of him, and my grandma told us about what happened. About a year and a half to 2 years later, her health went downhill. It was 60 plus years since he was kidnapped, and my grandma was a couple of months from passing, so my mom and aunt hired a PI who managed to find him. He had been living in Brazil ever since he was taken and had an entire family down there. They got to reconnect over FaceTime and she got to meet an entire side of her family she didn't even know existed. They talked on the phone and FaceTime numerous times a week all the way up until she passed. Story 30. I didn't hire a PI, but my uncles did because my cousin ran away from home. My uncles are wealthy, and as the only child of my third uncle, she was and would have always been provided for in every way. But the only thing my cousin wanted in life was to fall in love and be a mother, and my wealthy relatives couldn't give her that. She didn't want to have an arranged marriage. Soon after finishing her secondary education, she ran away with a boyfriend she'd been keeping secret, got married, and had a baby. She was his third or fourth wife. The PI checks in on her once a year and reports to my family on how she's doing. The boyfriend wasn't a good husband. My uncles tried to pull her and the baby out of the situation, but it only pushed her further away from us. Last I heard, she took her son and finally ran away from her husband and went back to her mother's house. It broke my third uncle's heart that she won't come back. My cousin was his shining light, and I know he misses her very much because sometimes he accidentally calls me by her name. He's extra sweet to the girls of my generation since losing his daughter. He only gets to see her in photos the PI sends. She came home only once after she left, to announce her marriage and to say goodbye. Story 31. Ooh, one I can answer. My mom was given up at birth and hired a PI to find her biological mom around 4 years ago. She didn't have enough savings to find both her parents, so she chose her mom. But in the process of finding her mom, the PI also found her dad. It turns out her dad lived in a house she would run by every day for cross-country in high school, and she never knew about it, which is absolutely crazy to me. It turns out she has 3 older half-brothers, and I have 2 first cousins I never knew about. My first time meeting them was at one of their weddings a little over a year ago. I wish it was all sunshine and roses with the story, but it takes a weird turn. My mom kind of up and decided to move back to her hometown to be closer to her biological family and get a fresh start. My mom and dad weren't on the best of terms anymore, and I think she decided it was a sign. I haven't seen her in a little over a year, and it threw a big wrench in my relationship with my newly found cousins for a while. It was no fault of theirs, but it felt like she abandoned our side of the family for this new one, so it was hard. Story 32. Kind of a funny one. Dad was working 100 plus weeks for a better part of 3 years building his business, and the time at home, he'd spend time being a dad. One week, when my brother and I got home from school, we went on business as usual and played PlayStation and watched cartoons until about 8 p.m. to do our homework in front of my mom, so she'd think we weren't stupid. Well, my mom didn't come home and we assumed they were busy working, so we just went to bed. Didn't see anyone home in the morning, which wasn't unusual, so we got ready for school like normal. This continued for 3 days, and when our sister came home from uni, she asked where our parents are, and we shrugged our shoulders and said, haven't seen them in forever, and she panicked, asked around the neighborhood and didn't get any info. This is where it gets hazy since it was recounted to me, but apparently she went to the police station. Yes, she left my brother and I alone at home, and after getting no info, she was referred to a PI. The PI went around and checked his usual spots for delinquent parents, casinos, strip clubs, motels, bars, and didn't see their cars or anyone who looked like them. The next day, he went to check Dad's company and asked around, and he found out that our parents went on vacation to Acapulco. The guy visited us at home, relayed this info, and said the most rational thing anyone had ever said. They had to have left something to let you know, right? Turns out they did. They left it in the mailbox because they'd figured we checked the mail daily and left us contact info, money, a checkbook, and emergency contacts just in case. Looking back, it makes sense. It was December. We were almost out of school. Sister was on winter break. It was Mom's birthday a few days before they left. We were just a bit too dense to check the mailbox since it is something you check daily. For reference, this was in the early 2000s, so we didn't have cell phones because our parents thought we wouldn't need one. After that, they realized we weren't the brightest kids and needed them just in case we were ever in need of help. And if any of these stories got to you too, here's more for you. YouTube thinks you're going to love this. I'll catch you in that video.